Imagine you're 7 years old. You wake up before sunrise. There is no warm bedroom waiting for you. No breakfast cereal, no school bus, no cartoons playing in the background. Instead, the first thing you feel is cold. Not the kind of cold that disappears when you turn up the heater. The kind of cold that follows you everywhere. The kind that can decide whether you survive another winter. Outside, the world is enormous, wild, and completely indifferent to your existence. There are no doctors if you get sick, no supermarkets if food runs out, no phones to call for help. And yet, somehow children just like you survived. Not only did they survive, they learned, explored, played, laughed, and eventually grew up to become the ancestors of every person alive today. But how difficult was that childhood, really? What was it actually like to grow up in a world where every day carried a new challenge, where a simple mistake could have serious consequences, and where learning how to survive was far more important than learning how to read? The popular image of Stone Age children is surprisingly simple. Many people imagine them sitting near cave fires while adults did all the important work, but archaeology tells a very different story. In reality, childhood may have been one of the most demanding stages of life in the prehistoric world, because long before children learned stories, they had to learn survival, and the lessons they learned helped our species conquer some of the harshest environments on Earth. So if you had been born thousands of years ago, during the age of hunters and gatherers, would you have made it to adulthood? If your answer is yes, you might be imagining something very different from what prehistoric childhood actually looked like. After all, popular culture has painted a familiar picture for decades. You have probably seen it before. A small group of cave people huddled around a fire, children sitting safely nearby, adults doing the hunting, the gathering, and all the difficult work. In that version of history, childhood seems surprisingly simple, maybe a little uncomfortable, maybe a little primitive, but not fundamentally different from today. The problem is that much of that picture comes from modern imagination rather than archaeological evidence. In fact, one of the biggest misconceptions about Stone Age children is the idea that they were mostly passive observers of adult life. The reality appears to have been very different. For most of human history, survival depended on knowledge, not strength, not size, knowledge. Knowing which berries could keep you alive and which could make you sick. Knowing where water could be found during a dry season. Knowing how to recognize the tracks of an animal long before you could see it. And unlike today, there was no classroom where that knowledge could be stored. No books, no internet, no written instructions. Every generation had to pass critical survival skills directly to the next. That meant children were not simply waiting to become useful adults. They were already learning to become survivors. Archaeologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, both ancient and more recent, have found that children often spent much of their day observing, exploring, experimenting, and gradually participating in the activities that kept their communities alive. What looked like play was often practice. A game could teach tracking, throwing sticks could teach hunting skills, exploring the landscape could teach navigation. Even curiosity had survival value. And that changes the entire way we think about childhood in the Stone Age, because the biggest challenge facing prehistoric children was not boredom, it was preparation. The world they were growing up in demanded skills far earlier than most children today could imagine. But before they could learn those skills, they first had to survive a much more immediate problem. A problem so serious that it shaped nearly every aspect of childhood. Simply staying alive long enough to grow up. Simply staying alive long enough to grow up. That may sound obvious. But for much of human history, it was one of the greatest challenges a child would ever face. Today, childhood is often viewed as the safest stage of life. You are surrounded by medicine, clean water, heated homes, stocked grocery stores, and systems designed to protect children from danger. Most of those protections are so common that you rarely notice them. Now imagine removing all of them. No hospitals, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no emergency services, no guarantee that tomorrow's meal even exists. Suddenly, survival becomes a daily question rather than an assumption. And for a Stone Age child, that question began almost immediately after birth. The prehistoric world was not constantly dangerous in the dramatic way movies often portray it. The greatest threats were usually far less obvious. A minor infection, several days without enough food, a harsh winter, contaminated water, a simple accident that nobody knew how to treat. Problems that modern people often solve in a matter of hours could become life-threatening challenges. This is one reason why many researchers believe childhood mortality was significantly higher than it is today. Not because prehistoric people were careless. Quite the opposite. Families invested enormous effort into protecting their children. The problem was that they were living in environments where nature had the final say. If food became scarce, children were often the first to feel the effects. Their growing bodies required energy every single day. Missing meals was not just uncomfortable. It could slow development, weaken the immune system, and make other challenges even harder to survive. Then there was the climate. Depending on where and when you lived, temperatures could swing dramatically between seasons. A child could not simply put on another manufactured jacket or retreat into a heated building. Warmth had to be created, maintained, protected, every day. And there was another challenge that is easy to overlook. Knowledge. A newborn deer can stand within hours. Many animals are capable of surviving on instinct alone. Human children are different. You are born with extraordinary potential, but very little practical knowledge. Everything that makes humans successful, finding food, making tools, understanding landscapes, cooperating with others, must be learned. That creates a fascinating paradox. Human childhood is unusually long compared to many other animals. At first glance, that seems like a weakness. Why spend so many years dependent on adults? But evolution appears to have favored exactly that strategy, because the world our ancestors lived in was so complex that children needed years to master it. Before a child could become a hunter, a gatherer, a toolmaker, or a skilled member of the group, they first needed time to learn. And time was something nature did not always provide. This was the central challenge of prehistoric childhood, not simply avoiding danger, but surviving long enough to absorb the knowledge that would eventually make survival possible. So how did Stone Age families solve that problem? How did they protect children in a world filled with uncertainty while also teaching them the skills they would need for the rest of their lives? The answer was surprisingly ingenious, and it began with something that every child, no matter where or when they lived, needed more than anything else: a community. A community. That may not sound revolutionary, but it may have been one of the most important survival technologies our species ever developed. If you imagine a Stone Age mother raising a child entirely on her own, you are probably imagining a situation that would have been incredibly difficult. Hunter-gatherer life demanded constant work. Food had to be found, water had to be collected, tools had to be repaired, shelters had to be maintained, and many of those tasks required adults to travel significant distances from camp. So who watched the children? The answer was often everyone. Grandparents, older siblings, aunts, uncles, trusted members of the group. Anthropologists sometimes describe humans as cooperative breeders because raising children has rarely been the responsibility of only two parents. Instead, entire communities contributed to keeping the next generation alive. Imagine being 5 years old. Your mother leaves with a group gathering edible plants. Your father joins a hunting expedition. Yet you are not alone. You are surrounded by people who know your name, recognize your face, and understand that your survival matters to the future of the group. In many ways, childhood was protected not by walls or technology, but by social bonds. And those bonds created something incredibly valuable: time. Time for children to learn. Time for children to grow. Time for childhood itself to exist. But even with an entire community helping, there was still a problem. Children needed more than protection. They needed food, and feeding a growing child in the prehistoric world was a challenge all by itself. Imagine spending most of your day searching for enough calories to survive. Now imagine doing that while supporting several children whose bodies are constantly growing. Every successful meal mattered, every failed hunting trip mattered, every season mattered. Yet this is where another surprising advantage appeared. Children were not simply mouths to feed, they gradually became contributors. At first, their contributions were small: collecting firewood, gathering edible berries, carrying water, watching younger children, simple tasks that might seem insignificant today. But multiplied across an entire community, these efforts made a real difference. This created an unusual system. Unlike many animals, human children spent years learning productive skills before becoming fully independent, and they learned those skills through participation. Not lectures, not classrooms, participation. A child followed adults, observed adults, imitated adults, and slowly became capable of performing the same tasks. What looks like work and what looks like play often blended together. A game of throwing sticks might help develop coordination. A playful chase could improve endurance. Exploring nearby terrain could teach navigation. Children were learning constantly, even when they appeared to be having fun. But that wasn't the most remarkable part. The most remarkable part was how much knowledge a child could absorb before reaching adulthood. By modern standards, many Stone Age children possessed an astonishing understanding of their environment. They could identify useful plants, recognize animal tracks, predict weather changes, remember water sources, navigate landscapes without maps. These were not specialized skills, they were survival skills, and survival depended on mastering them. However, there was one challenge that no amount of knowledge could completely eliminate: nature itself. A child might understand the landscape perfectly. A family might cooperate flawlessly. A community might share food generously. Yet all of them remained vulnerable to the same powerful force, the changing seasons, because for many Stone Age children, the most difficult test of the year arrived when the weather began to change. Because for many Stone Age children, the most difficult test of the year arrived when the weather began to change. Today, a drop in temperature usually means reaching for a jacket. You step inside, turn on the heat, close a window, problem solved. For a Stone Age child, winter was not an inconvenience. It was an obstacle that had to be prepared for months in advance. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the familiar landscape is changing. The days are becoming shorter. The air feels colder. Plants that once provided food are disappearing. Animals are beginning to migrate. Everything around you is sending the same message. Winter is coming, and winter does not negotiate. If your group failed to prepare, no amount of bravery would save you. Food had to be gathered before it vanished. Animal hides had to be cleaned and processed. Firewood had to be collected. Shelters had to be maintained. Even children played a role in this seasonal race against time. A young child might help gather sticks, carry small bundles, watch younger siblings while adults worked. The tasks were simple, but they mattered because survival was a collective effort. One of the greatest advantages prehistoric families possessed was something we often take for granted today. Clothing. Not fashionable clothing, not comfortable clothing, survival clothing. Animal hides, fur, and carefully prepared skins created a portable shelter that traveled with you wherever you went. To a modern observer, a fur garment may seem primitive, but in reality, it was an extraordinary piece of technology. It trapped heat, blocked wind, protected vulnerable skin, and allowed humans to expand into environments that would otherwise have been impossible to inhabit. For a child, that protection could make an enormous difference. Yet clothing alone was not enough. Humans needed another weapon against the cold: fire. It is difficult to overstate how important fire was to childhood in the prehistoric world. Fire provided warmth, light, protection, cooked food, a gathering place for stories and teaching. For children, the glow of a fire may have represented something deeper than comfort. It represented safety. Beyond the circle of light lay uncertainty. Inside it was family, knowledge, community. But here is what makes the story even more fascinating. Children were not merely protected by these technologies, they were learning them. A child watching adults maintain a fire was learning a survival skill. A child helping prepare animal hides was learning a survival skill. A child observing how shelters were built was learning a survival skill. Every winter became a classroom, and every challenge became a lesson. Over time, children developed an intimate understanding of their environment. They learned which valleys stayed warmer, which plants remained available during colder months, which animal migrations could be predicted. Knowledge accumulated year after year, generation after generation. This was one reason humans became so remarkably adaptable. We did not survive because we were the strongest animals. We survived because we learned, and we taught what we learned. But even warmth, shelter, and knowledge could not solve every problem. There was still another challenge waiting beyond the campfire, a challenge that followed children everywhere they went. Because the prehistoric world was not only cold, it was alive, filled with animals, unfamiliar terrain, hidden dangers, and constant uncertainty. And learning how to navigate that world may have been one of the most important lessons of all. Because the prehistoric world was not only cold, it was alive, filled with animals, changing landscapes, hidden opportunities, and constant uncertainty. And learning how to navigate that world may have been one of the most important lessons of all. Imagine stepping outside your camp as a child. There are no street signs, no maps, no fences marking where it is safe to go. The landscape stretches in every direction. Forests, grasslands, rivers, rock formations. Every feature of the environment contains information. The question is whether you know how to read it. For a Stone Age child, learning to interpret the world was as important as learning language itself. A broken branch might reveal that an animal passed through recently. Fresh tracks in the mud could indicate which direction a herd had traveled. The behavior of birds might hint at nearby water. Cloud patterns could signal changing weather. To modern eyes, these details seem easy to overlook, but to prehistoric humans, they were valuable clues. The landscape was constantly speaking. Children simply had to learn its language, and they started learning much earlier than most people imagine. At first, they watched. They followed older children and adults through familiar terrain. They listened to stories around the fire, stories that were entertaining but also practical, stories about dangerous places, reliable water sources, seasonal migrations, landmarks that helped people find their way home. Knowledge was not stored in books. It was stored in memory, passed from one generation to the next through observation and storytelling. But eventually, observation was not enough. Every child reached a point where they had to explore. Not recklessly, carefully, gradually, the boundaries expanded. A little farther from camp, a little more responsibility, a little more independence. And with every new experience, confidence grew. This process may sound familiar, because in many ways, it is exactly how humans still learn today. We experiment, we make small mistakes, we gain experience, we become more capable. The difference is that prehistoric children were learning skills directly connected to survival. And surprisingly, play may have been one of the most effective teaching tools. Children everywhere love games. That has probably been true for tens of thousands of years. But in hunter-gatherer societies, games often doubled as training. Running developed endurance. Throwing improved coordination. Imitating animals sharpened observation skills. Friendly competitions encouraged problem-solving. What looked like fun was often preparing children for challenges they would face later in life. And this may explain one of the most remarkable aspects of human childhood. Unlike many species, humans spend years learning before reaching adulthood. At first, that seems inefficient. Why remain dependent for so long? Why not grow up quickly? But evolution appears to have favored a different strategy. Humans became successful not because we matured faster, but because we learned more. Our long childhood gave us time to absorb enormous amounts of information about the world around us. Information that no instinct alone could provide. And by the time many Stone Age children reached their early teenage years, they were already becoming skilled contributors to their communities. They knew the landscape. They understood seasonal patterns. They could help gather food, assist with tools, care for younger children, and participate in the daily work of survival. In other words, childhood was slowly coming to an end. But before these young people could fully step into adult life, there was one final transformation they had to undergo. A transition that looked very different from modern graduations, report cards, or school diplomas. Because in the Stone Age, adulthood was not defined by age. It was defined by capability. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of all. The comforts of modern childhood, warm homes, safe communities, education, and the freedom to dream about the future didn't appear overnight. They were built upon countless generations of children who learned, adapted, and survived in a world far more uncertain than our own. In many ways, their story is still your story. Because every skill, every instinct, and every human connection you rely on today is part of a legacy that stretches back thousands of generations. If you enjoyed this journey into the lives of our ancient ancestors and want to explore more stories about human evolution, prehistoric survival, psychology, and the hidden forces that shaped who we are today, be sure to subscribe to Duck Psychology. And until our next journey into the deep past, thank you for watching.